Hearing come to order. We want to thank the witnesses for their patience. I won't thank you too much so we can get right to the hearing. These roll calls are a democratic necessity, so here we go. We're meeting today to hear testimony on the transatlantic impacts of trade disputes between the United States and the European Union. Without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I'll now make an opening statement, then turn it over to the ranking member for his opening statement, and officially start this part of the hearing. I'd like to welcome you to the hearing today to discuss our trade policy towards Europe. I've been monitoring the positive and lately negative developments in our trade relationship with Europe for some time now, along with many of our members. That's because I'm a big believer in what we can accomplish together as part of our transatlantic alliance if we also seized on our collective economic strength. Together, the EU and the U.S. represent nearly half the world's GDP. We are each other's largest trading partner. We have the leading services in terms of service economy globally, and we represent well over half the global foreign direct investment. We represent a formidable economic base that should be leading the world towards a better economic opportunity for families and our communities back home, for greater prosperity, for people in developing countries and in new democracies, and for fairer trade rules for our businesses to compete on an even playing field. Regrettably, instead of continuing negotiations with the EU towards a trade investment agreement, the President withdrew from the talks that we were ongoing and pursued a hardline strategy of imposing tariffs on our allies, then added insult to injury by invoking national security as a justification for imposing them, as if we were vulnerable to a national security threat from our allies because they sell us steel and aluminum. There are, as there have been for a long time, many real trade issues to figure out in our relationship with the EU. That's why we're negotiating an agreement with the EU, and we've been doing so back since 2016. And that's why we're again negotiating. The only way out of this mess is to negotiate a trade agreement. Except this time around, businesses are teetering on the edge of closure as these tariffs continue. This tariff policy completely ignores how integrated our supply chains have become. It's not some foreign government footing the bill for these tariffs either. It's our businesses and our consumers. It's especially small and medium-sized businesses who bear the brunt of it because they don't have an in-house trade compliance field of experts that our larger corporations have. They chose the safe route trading with our allies who share our values, who share our business practices, and now they're paying for it. I hear from so many businesses back home, veteran-owned businesses, small manufacturing companies, farmers. Our cranberry industry was threatened by this as well. They are, and I really mean this, desperately trying to navigate the complex world of tariffs, exclusion from these tariffs, regulatory agencies, and higher costs. So many are panicked about going out of business altogether. I've talked to them. They're worried about forfeiting their market share to companies in other countries that have not pursued such a reckless path of tariffs as we have. So we're negotiating again with the EU, but in reality, we're back to square one, except now, every day, middle-class Americans are footing the bill. We've missed out on 2.5 years when we could have been increasing our collective economic strength to compete with China, which is the only way we're going to be successful in countering Chinese practices. Through coordinated trade practices constructed on shared values that reflect fair wages, safe working conditions, respect for intellectual property, rule of law, and environmental responsibility. But we've unnecessarily taken shots at our allies when we should be working with them more closely than ever before to confront deeply serious threats around the world. It does not strengthen our hand in the face of our adversaries like Russia and China to drive unnecessary wedges between us and our allies. So I'm pleased to be holding this hearing today so that we can hear from this expert panel on these issues. We have to hear you today and learn why these issues are so important, why there's a sense of urgency to negotiate a resolution to this trade dispute with the EU, and what steps we can take going forward to get back to a place where our transatlantic economic relationship is a stronger component of our overall alliance. It's critical for our business back home. It's critical for our own economy. It's critical for projecting strength abroad and pushing back against our adversaries. And frankly, it's just common sense. So with that, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here, and I turn over to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Well, I thank the chairman, and thank you all for being here and being patient with us. We mentioned with the votes. I believe in free and fair trade, and I believe that free trade increases global security while creating jobs here in the United States, both of which are net positives. For that reason, it's important to support policies that encourage global trade, open new markets, break down barriers in existing markets, and establish rules that are fair to all participants. And I want to stress fair because that's where the main issue is. Countries around the world, including some of our closest allies, have taken advantage of the United States' willingness to engage in free trade. They put up barriers, especially giving their workers an unfair advantage over American workers. Europe displays unbalanced favoritism to its manufacturing sector. While European companies are typically allowed to bid on certain U.S. government contracts, U.S. manufacturers are generally not offered the same opportunities. Further compounding this issue are their subsidies for their supply base in the form of a VAT tax, rebates, and other indirect measures. In response to these wrongs, President Trump took action by using his Section 232 authority to place tariffs on steel and aluminum. I recognize and share the President's interest in protecting American workers, innovation, and business from unfair trading practices. Allowing a country like China to continue to steal American innovations and inventions not only puts our economy at risk, but also our national security. However, I do not believe that aluminum and steel imported from Europe poses a national security threat to our nation. Any tariffs imposed should be tailored to address individual irregularities caused by biased trade practices. Trade between the United States and Europe accounts for nearly half of the global GDP. We're not talking about tariffs amounting to pennies on the dollar or rounding errors. Any major disruption in the transatlantic economy would be devastating to the world. We must reduce the barriers put up by both American and European leaders in the past to increase competition and further attract the world's best talent to the West. In my district, the 16th district in Illinois, we're a hub for manufacturing and agriculture. In fact, Illinois ranks third in the nation for the export of ag commodities, with over $8 billion worth of goods going overseas. And much of that comes from my district. I've heard from many industries affected by our trade dispute with the EU. While their bottom line is being hurt, they understand that unfair trade practices placed against American industry hurts them more in the long run. They, like me, are hopeful we can come to a quick and equitable resolution to stand united against the main aggressor, which is China. The so-called 16+1 initiative between China and many Eastern and Central European nations has Beijing offering developmental projects in exchange for increased cooperation. China has executed over 350 mergers, investments, and joint ventures across Europe. In many cases, they can access critical information about how these systems work or even steal sensitive intellectual property. More than half of China's investment in Europe is in the largest economies, Germany, the UK, France, and Italy. What concerns me, though, is that these are linchpins in our NATO alliance. China has now passed the U.S. as Germany's largest trading partner, and they're closing the gap for Europe as a whole. We've seen the Chinese invest over $70 billion in the United Kingdom, trying to get a foot in the door in any anticipation of a Brexit deal that sees the Brits leaving the EU. Trade tension between the United States and Europe do not signal the end of the transatlantic partnership. Our bond is strong, forged by years of partnership and battling common threats which have developed our shared values. We will not always be 100% in agreement with the EU, but we will always work together to ensure that our people are taken care of and the world is a safer place for the next generation. I cannot stress enough the need for the United States and the EU to solve our differences quickly in order to develop a transatlantic strategy to counter Chinese maligned influence and trade practices before it's too late. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to the conversation. I yield back.
Thank the ranking member. I'll now introduce our witnesses briefly. Dr. Daniel Hamilton is the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation professor at Johns Hopkins University School for Advanced International Studies and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. Ms. Marjorie Chorlins is Vice President for European Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Executive Director of the U.S.-UK Business Council. She's a former Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Import Administration at the Department of Commerce, and we thank you also for submitting your documents. Members will look at it as a state-by-state breakdown of the effects of this. Dr. Chad Bown is a Regional Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and a former Senior Economist for International Trade and Investment at the White House on the Council of Economic Advisors. Dr. Theodore Broman is a Senior Research Fellow in Anglo-American Relations for the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. We appreciate all of you being here today and look forward to your testimony. Please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the record. I'll now go to Dr. Hamilton for his statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to submit the testimony for the record, and I have an appendix which also does the state-by-state breakdown, which I'd like to add to that.
Yeah, with no objection.
Thank you.
So added.
So thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about how the U.S.-EU disputes over trade and other issues are affecting U.S. foreign policy and broader economic relations. I believe if we look at the kinds of tensions we're facing right now across the Atlantic, I would just briefly say I think there are 3 kinds of costs that we have to think about. One are direct costs. As both you and the ranking member mentioned, we're facing steel and aluminum tariffs, which, because of the dense interlinkage across the Atlantic, affect directly those industries. The car industry is facing potentially 25% tariffs that the U.S. might impose on the European car industry, which will ricochet back into the American market. And it's really always important to understand this dense interlinkage of the transatlantic economy. So the car industry, European companies directly support about 173,000 U.S. jobs here because of their investment. The indirects or downstream jobs with suppliers and all of that's about 420,000 U.S. jobs. It's about a quarter of the U.S. production in the auto industry is by European companies in the United States, about $34 billion contributing to U.S. GDP. Many of those are U.S. exports. So 60% of the cars produced by European companies in the United States are made in the USA and are exported to the rest of the world. So the U.S. is their platform for that. And one of the features of the U.S. auto industry is its innovation capacity. So European companies invest a lot in innovation in the United States through the auto industry, about $5.5 billion in R&D that they bring to the U.S. economy. The auto trade is about 10% of transatlantic trade, so if that goes south, that's a big chunk of our relationship. And Europe is also, of course, a big customer for American cars. About 20% of U.S. car exports go to Europe. So that's a direct cost if we would go down this road of a potential trade war. That's just one example of how a particular industry would be affected. But there are many indirect and spillover costs because of this distinctive nature of the U.S.-European economy. Again, we're so deeply linked not only by trade but by these investment flows, which really actually are the driver of the transatlantic economy rather than trade. Trade kind of follows the investment. And so what's happening now is because of these tensions, you can see in the numbers that this is starting to chill investment coming into the United States from Europe. Investors don't quite know should they invest right now. And because Europe is the major, by far the largest investor in the United States and the world, about 68% of the $4 trillion in foreign capital sunk in the United States comes from Europe, and 76% in the U.S. manufacturing industry. So really nobody else is really investing in U.S. manufacturing except the Europeans, and then they produce here, and I say export from here as U.S. manufactured exports. And of course, they are the largest supplier of onshore jobs in America. We estimate between the U.S. and Europe up to 16 million jobs on both sides of the Atlantic are reliant on this, this commercial interaction. And one needs to understand this deep interlinkage between the investment and the trade. European investment is diverse. It's in all the 50 states. The data we provide you in the testimony shows that. It generates income and jobs for U.S. workers. Sales for local suppliers and businesses, extra revenues for local communities through taxes, and a lot of capital investment in R&D, as I mentioned. I see Congressman Wilson's here. My example I always use is BMW, and it just shows you, the story just tells you all you need to know. So BMW in Munich has built this plant in Spartanburg, which is now bigger than the plant in Munich. Yeah, and what they do, they produce the engines and front bumper assemblies in Munich, and then they send them to Spartanburg to assemble the final car, and then they export to the rest of the world, making BMW actually the #1 U.S. car exporter by value. But what happens? You take the engine from Munich, you send it to the United States, you pay a 2.5% tariff to put it in Spartanburg, you export it back to Europe, you pay another 10% tariff to get it back to Europe, and then if we add another 25%, this just is really not making a whole lot of sense to the people of Spartanburg. It's not about the Europeans, it's about the people in Spartanburg. So rather than sort of add tariffs, we should be dismantling all of them. That's the premise of the negotiations that could start if we get going between the U.S. and the EU. And the key is to keep the investment flowing, because that's actually what's driving all of this. The trade is sort of just on the top of the investment. So if you shut it down, you're shutting down jobs, innovation in Spartanburg and the whole region, and the whole distribution channels that flow past Spartanburg. And I have many examples in the state of Massachusetts and others. The last cost, though, I just want to mention is opportunity cost. Because what's happening is we are missing opportunities for more jobs and growth across the Atlantic by this sort of fighting each other instead of looking at the bigger picture. I think both of you had mentioned how important that relationship is. The fact that we're squabbling about this overshadows a really important fact that actually the United States and the EU agree on what to do about China. We agree that China has a problem. The Europeans agree with us about assaults on intellectual property, on forced technology transfer, and all the things that we're having trouble with the Chinese with. And yet we're having a distraction by competing with each other. So we're not harnessing the leverage we could have to get China back sort of on board. And I think that's a huge opportunity cost that we're missing out on.
Thank you. Ms. Jorlins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Kinzinger, I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. As you've said, Mr. Chairman, the transatlantic economy remains by far the most successful bilateral commercial partnership in the world. There are innumerable opportunities to build on that partnership and equally grave risks if the tensions continue to escalate. In June 2018, the Trump administration imposed tariffs on imports of EU steel and aluminum on national security grounds, despite the fact, as you mentioned, that most EU countries are NATO members and treaty allies of the U.S. When the steel and aluminum tariffs were announced, Chamber CEO Tom Donahue said, quote, "These new unlawful tariffs will directly harm American manufacturers and provoke widespread retaliation from our trading partners," unquote. Unfortunately, those predictions have come true. Meanwhile, the looming threat of 25% tariffs on imports of autos and auto parts is of grave concern. We trade nearly 10 times as much in the auto sector as we do in steel and aluminum across the Atlantic. Again, quoting the Chamber CEO, quote, "The U.S. Chamber strongly opposes the administration's threat to impose tariffs on auto imports in the name of national security. The U.S. auto industry is prospering as never before, and these tariffs risk overturning all of this progress. While a final decision on auto tariffs has been postponed for 6 months, the threat continues to erode trust between Europe and the U.S. Where the United States has been applying new tariffs on our friends and allies, the EU has been negotiating new market opening agreements. Brussels has concluded agreements with Japan and Canada and upgraded its existing agreement with Mexico. In a growing number of countries, European exporters actually enjoy better access than U.S. companies. When it comes to China, the U.S. government, the Chamber, and Europe are indeed aligned on the challenges. But pursuing a unilateral tariff-driven approach is not the optimal way to effect lasting change in China. A coordinated approach would be much more powerful. Another flashpoint concerns tax policy. Several European countries are considering digital services taxes that would disproportionately affect American companies. An informed and inclusive discussion on modernizing the international tax system is occurring at the OECD. Unilateral European actions erode trust and undermine prospects for an international agreement. The Chamber was among the earliest and most vocal proponents of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership negotiations. We do regret that those talks were not concluded, but continue to believe that progress can and indeed must be made. Last July, President Trump and European Commission President Juncker announced new talks intended to lower transatlantic tariffs, remove non-tariff barriers, and enable closer cooperation on shared challenges. We are very encouraged that the administration has returned to the negotiating table. The Chamber has flagged several ways the two sides can boost economic growth, create good jobs, and enhance competitiveness through a reinforced partnership. Our recommendations were submitted for the record today, but let me highlight just a few. First, while the Chamber advocates for comprehensive trade agreements that address not just trade in services, but also, not just trade in goods, but also services, investment, procurement, and other issues, tariffs on industrial goods have recently been the chief focus of U.S. and EU officials. Elimination of tariffs could boost U.S. exports to the EU by as much as $50 billion, according to just one study. Second, U.S. and EU policymakers should continue to promote regulatory cooperation. The two sides should try to establish common standards where none exist and where both sides are considering new rules. The emergence of autonomous vehicles is but one instance where the two sides can and should cooperate. The U.S. and EU should also pursue mutual recognition of existing regulations in the many cases where our different approaches meet common regulatory objectives. We do understand that any conversation about trade with the EU must tackle politically sensitive issues such as agriculture. It is well understood indeed that a trade liberalizing agreement that doesn't cover agriculture is a political non-starter in Congress. As we develop strategies on cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, the two sides should continue to develop common approaches that reflect our shared values and commitment to transparent stakeholder engagement. Both sides also must take steps to ensure the Internet remains globally connected and interoperable. Our interdependent digital economies and security depend on the ability to move data across borders efficiently and safely. The Privacy Shield, which facilitates cross-border data flows while protecting personal privacy, must be reaffirmed. The U.S. and Europe also should work closely with stakeholders to incentivize circular economy investments and promote resource efficiency. Transatlantic cooperation will make it easier for American and European firms to lead the way in addressing resource challenges and a changing climate while fostering economic growth. Finally, transatlantic defense and security cooperation remains a cornerstone of our alliance. In light of a fast-changing global security environment, including cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns, transatlantic cooperation remains essential. As the EU boosts its own strategic capabilities, its efforts must complement and be coordinated with NATO's priorities. Any new European defense projects must allow for fair and transparent competition, including for American companies. Mr. Chairman, transatlantic trade tensions are occurring against the backdrop of several non-commercial disagreements that also have significant economic spillover effects. We encourage the subcommittee to engage actively with the administration and with European policymakers to address these issues collaboratively. In sum, there can be no effective resolution of our shared economic challenges without robust and constructive engagement between the U.S. and Europe. Thank you very much.
Dr. Bowen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking member and the subcommittee for the invitation to be here today. Several actions taken by the Trump administration over the last 2 years have severely strained trade relations between Europe and the United States, weakening the transatlantic backbone of the global rules-based trading system. But an even more worrisome threat to that relationship may be in the offing. It comes in the form of the President's warning that he may impose trade restrictions on tens of billions of dollars of imports from Europe of automobiles and automobile parts, contending that they threaten America's national security. The national security threat is fanciful, and Congress should amend existing statutes to constrain the executive branch's abuse of this power on trade. No evidence supports the argument that imports of automobiles and parts from our closest European allies threaten America's national security. In fact, invoking Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 by declaring such a threat to justify trade restrictions would damage the U.S. economy, create uncertainty, poison trust, and sow massive disruptions through both retaliation and copycat behavior relying on this same flimsy rationale. 3 reasons demonstrate why imposing trade restrictions on European automobiles and parts would disrupt the American economy. First, American consumers would be hit by price hikes. Fiats, Volkswagens, and Volvos, amongst other brands, would become more expensive. And the reduced competition would inevitably raise prices of all cars, regardless of the make and model. Second, the American manufacturing base would lose access to imported auto parts that it needs to produce cars for both domestic consumption and export. Imported parts are vital for American-based auto plants to keep costs low for high-quality cars made in states like Alabama, Tennessee, and South Carolina. The facilities in these and other states make some of America's most successful exports. Restricting trade in these parts would hurt these factories and their workers. Third, Europe will retaliate. The European Union has announced it would impose counter tariffs on U.S. exports, a credible threat because it did so last year when President Trump imposed tariffs on their exports of steel and aluminum. Those European tariffs hit more than $3 billion worth of U.S. exports, hurting American farmers and businesses. It would be surprising if you haven't already heard complaints from your districts. Among those suffering are corn farmers and makers of bourbon and whiskey, cosmetics, motorboats and yachts, peanut butter, playing cards, and motorcycles. I could name dozens of other products affected by that retaliation. The example of Harley-Davidson illustrates the futility of the Trump administration's tariffs. Harley has announced in a Securities and Exchange Commission filing that Europe's counter tariffs mean it can no longer afford to produce motorcycles in the United States for sale in Europe. Harley-Davidson and many other U.S. manufacturers know that 95% of their customers live outside of the United States' borders. By making it more expensive to make products for those customers, the Trump administration is forcing these companies to transfer manufacturing to some other country not hit by these cost increases. Imposing trade restrictions on European autos would also exacerbate 3 additional policy concerns. First, such a step would likely end bilateral trade negotiations between the U.S. and the EU, including talks on several vital issues, such as regulations that constitute the largest barriers to existing trade. Despite President Trump's colorful anecdotes, the tariffs that the EU applies on imports from the United States are not one-sided. They are comparable, in fact, to the average tariffs the United States applies on imports from Europe, especially for manufactured products. But these non-tariff barriers to trade can only be tackled through regulatory cooperation. The process of doing so began under the Obama administration through the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership negotiations. The Trump administration has, to its credit, continued some elements of that process, and a deal on conformity assessments would be an important next step for transatlantic trade. But new auto tariffs and counter tariffs would strangle that progress, just as it holds promise of achieving results. Second, imposing these tariffs would escalate tensions, impeding cooperations in other areas of vital joint interest. More, not less, cooperation is urgently needed between Europe and the United States on e-commerce, the internet, data localization, cybersecurity, a potential digital services tax, and many other hugely important areas of the new economy. The United States cannot afford to squander or disrupt any effort toward protecting consumers and businesses in the increasingly technologically sophisticated marketplace. Third, the tariffs would further exacerbate the Trump administration's failures to take up the offer by Europe and other allies to resolve issues of mutual concern in other trade areas. The most serious, of course, is the administration's decision to confront its closest economic partners, including Japan as well as Europe, rather than enlisting them to put collective pressure on China. Going it alone on China may be doomed to fail. But also important is the administration's disengagement on many issues that desperately need to be addressed to reform the World Trade Organization. Its current refusal to appoint new members to the WTO's appellate body is undermining a dispute resolution framework that has helped many U.S. businesses far more than it has set them back. In sum, President Trump's threats to impose tariffs on imports of autos and parts from Europe must be taken seriously by Congress. His economically costly tariffs on steel and aluminum in 2018 make that current threat credible. And frankly, Congress never intended Section 232 to be used for this purpose. Thus, Congress should legislate changes to Section 232, as well as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to require the President to seek its approval before imposing new trade restrictions in the name of national security. Congress must recover from the administration its constitutional prerogative to reshape these laws so that they can no longer be abused. The The executive branch should not be imposing costs and unnecessary uncertainty on the American economy, further eroding American policy leadership and hurting U.S. global economic and foreign policy interests by circumventing the authority of Congress to establish trade policy as the Constitution prescribes.
Great. Dr. Broman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. The views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. The U.S. imposition of tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from the EU in 2018 was both unwise policy and unwise economics. The EU retaliations, coupled with the threats of additional U.S. tariffs in recent months on imports of cars from the EU, are equally unwise. But as previous episodes in this intermittent tariff conflict show, neither the policy impacts of these tariffs nor their novelty should be exaggerated. The frequency and history of U.S.-EU trade tensions strongly implies that today's conflicts are likely to fade over time. Unfortunately, they are likely to be replaced by new conflicts, some of which may already be visible. These tensions have in the past been caused or exacerbated by U.S. administrations with a strong commitment to free trade and to major U.S. post-war institutions such as NATO. There is therefore no reason to assume that these trade tensions today will inevitably lead to wider policy impacts beyond the realm of trade. Thus, while we should work vigorously to lessen today's conflicts, there is no need for panic. What is lacking today in the EU as much as in the United States is leadership that makes the simple and clear case for economic freedom. We need to emphasize the benefits that flow from free trade and free investment, and we need to emphasize the fact that economic freedom means much more than just free trade. The history of U.S. trade diplomacy with the EU over the past decade is deeply ironic. The Obama administration's Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, won favor with European leaders until they were pushed to reject it by their own outraged publics. The Trump administration's tariffs, on the other hand, are opposed by European leaders, but have not raised nearly the same level of public opposition in Europe that TTIP did. Today, it appears that a big deal like TTIP is unsustainably unpopular in Europe, while a smaller industrial goods-only deal is unacceptable to the United States because it omits agriculture. The result, sadly, is that there is no easy resolution to be had of the U.S.-EU trade conflict. However, the history of TTIP strongly suggests that the most dangerous thing the U.S. can do now is to respond to the current conflict by advocating the negotiation of a major U.S.-EU trade deal in the style of TTIP. There is no reason to believe that an effort to revive TTIP would not fan the same anti-Americanism that killed TTIP. Though the hostility engendered by TTIP on both sides of the Atlantic was deeply unfortunate, TTIP's approach was also, in my view, flawed. Because tariffs between the U.S. and the EU are already generally low, the majority of the gains from TTIP would have come from reducing non-tariff barriers, NTBs, between the U.S. and the EU. TTIP's approach was to reduce the burdens imposed by differing U.S. and EU regulations over the short run, while relying on regulatory harmonization over the long run. In time, the number of harmonized regulations would have grown, and the amount of regulatory competition between the U.S. and the EU would have declined. But while reducing the burdens of differing regulations would have been good for today's businesses, it would have been less good for tomorrow's businesses. The harmonized regulations would have tended to prevent new competitors from entering the harmonized transatlantic market. Harmonization around a costly standard of regulation may eliminate the burden caused by a lack of harmonization, but it does not eliminate the burden of the regulations themselves. TTIP's flaws, however, do not mean the Trump administration has chosen precisely the right approach. Its zero tariffs, zero NTBs, zero subsidies goal is the correct one, and its commitment to an ambitious U.S.-UK free trade area post-Brexit is laudable. But it has not found a successful diplomatic strategy to convince the EU to negotiate a genuinely zero-zero-zero agreement that includes agriculture. Furthermore, its chosen instrument of tariffs is both damaging to the U.S. consumer and raises wider concerns about its commitment to the U.S.'s post-war support for free trade. The zero-zero-zero goal and that wider commitment would have more credibility if the administration could point to a major negotiating success that involved a new trading partner, not merely the renegotiation of existing U.S. trading agreements. It is therefore good that the U.S. has emphasized its support for a U.S.-UK FTA, which offers the single best opportunity to negotiate an ambitious new agreement. While tariffs do matter, the greater risk to free trade and thus to economic growth are non-tariff barriers, an area where the U.S. is not guiltless, but where EU regulation poses greater risks. The U.S. should firmly adopt the position that the only acceptable level of tariff protection is zero. It should also move rapidly to negotiate ambitious free trade areas with partners, such as the UK after Brexit, which share its understanding that regulation imposes costs that are just as real and much larger than the tariffs on which the current U.S.-EU trade tensions have focused. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Broman. I'll now take this 5 minutes to ask my own questions. There's some differences of opinion. There's some differences to be worked out with the EU and the United States. But in my mind, there's one thing that just is without question, and perhaps the most serious problem that we have that we're addressing in the current climate now. And it can be summed up in one word: uncertainty. Uncertainty. The tariffs that have imposed and the stops and go and the threats and the threats for escalation have done nothing but create an uncertain environment. That has a tremendous cost economically, as Dr. Hamilton mentioned, in terms of opportunity, and it has an enormous cost in terms of a relationship and a coalition that's there that also is based on security. So if you could take just a second and comment on the real danger of creating this uncertainty and the damage that it's doing. Dr. Hamilton?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, as I mentioned, I agree with you fully, and we see that in the numbers. If you look at trends of investment coming into the United States from Europe, which I mentioned is by far the largest investor in the United States, over the last couple of years it's been going down. And if you talk to many of those companies, they say they don't quite know whether they should make that commitment. And that has impacts on local communities in terms of all the spillovers that I mentioned. But I think there's another issue about uncertainty now, is we don't know where this relationship is going. And I would argue in a world economy where 4 billion people have entered it over the last number of years, arising other powers that don't necessarily agree with the rules-based order that we and Europe had created, the window is simply closing on our ability to shape those rules. And if we squander this moment, time is not neutral.
And there's a vacuum, if I could interrupt. There's a vacuum that's there that'll probably be filled with China and countries that don't share those values. Is that correct?
We spend our time squabbling with each other rather than turning together to make sure we are the rule makers and not the rule takers. That's where the stakes are these days.
Yeah, if I could too, I just want to hit another issue. I don't exactly share the same views as Dr. Broman on these factors. Another concern about the relationship, that's what made me think of this. I think if we pursue, even though logistically it can't be done, I don't think from a practical basis right off the bat, but even the discussion of talk of, for instance, splitting off and doing a bilateral agreement with UK, US, to try and deal with the Brexit issue and turn our back in the process on 80% of our exports, the rest of Europe, I think that creates a problem, a serious problem going forward too. Mr. Shorless, would you like to, Sherlin, I'm sorry, would you like to do that, comment on that?
Mr. Chairman, I agree with you completely. Specifically with respect to the idea of a U.S.-UK free trade agreement, you're absolutely right. Practically speaking, until we know the terms of the UK's departure from the EU and the nature of its future relationship, it's really impossible for the U.S. to negotiate a new relationship with the UK. Uncertainty is indeed the gravest concern that the business community has. We have that in the context of Brexit in the UK, and we also have it in the context of the direction of the transatlantic relationship. This affects investment decisions, this affects supply chains, this affects movement of people, this affects movement of data. All of these are significant concerns and are best addressed when we're working together to address common challenges.
Yeah, I've got just about a minute left, so quickly I'd like to follow up on what Dr. Bone directly discussed and just get the feelings briefly within a minute or half a minute of the rest of the panel. But in any way, could this be justified, this tariff imposition on national security concerns? Dr. Baum?
No, I mean, it's it's impossible, I think, to come up with a rationale. So,
Yeah. Dr. Broman?
No.
Ms. Shorelands?
No.
Dr. Hamilton?
No.
And I must tell you, I've had private conversations with many of our European leaders, extraordinary number of conversations, frankly, in the last several months. And I must tell you, I think we miss this at home sometimes. They are disappointed and they're hurt about this relationship. They're carrying through with their NATO commitments in terms of working with us and trying to make good on promises, which they'll, I think, continue to do. But it has a real effect, and it has an effect on the people that these officials represent, which is a problem going forward, too. So I've gone over my time, and I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Pence.
Thank you, Chairman Keating and Ranking Member Kinzinger, and thank you all witnesses for being here today. Dr. Broman, in reading your prepared testimony, I was relieved to learn that the sky is not falling. It turns out that the United States and our European friends have had trade-related disagreements in the past. These disagreements span both Republican and Democratic administrations. I think we sometimes lose sight of these past disagreements when talking about the here and now. It's important to remember that the trading relationship between two of the world's largest and most complex economies is bound to have some principled disagreements, but this should not be confused as a fundamental change in our fantastic relationship. Moving into specifics, you mentioned agriculture in your prepared testimony. You said EU Trade Commissioner Cecilia Malmström has said, agriculture will certainly not be part of these negotiations. This is a red line for Europe. I come from an agriculture area. This position has obviously frustrated our trade negotiators. This is something I am very concerned about for the farmers, not only in my district, but across the United States. Building on this, you highlight a YouGov poll conducted in 2016 that found only 1 in 5 Germans think TTIP is a good thing, down from 55% in 2014. As you state, only half of the German public considered free trade a good idea, and a quarter rejected it completely. Dr. Broman, my question is, how can we address the EU protectionism in agricultural policies that disproportionately affect American farmers?
Thank you very much for your question, Mr. Pence. I view European agricultural protectionism as a major barrier to the negotiation of a successful U.S.-EU trade deal, and I share your profound reservations that the EU has taken agriculture off the table in any ongoing trade negotiations with the United States. I am obviously no apologist for U.S. tariffs and U.S. protectionism. I view U.S. tariffs, as I have said, as the wrong move to make, and I view U.S. and EU regulatory protectionism with an equally distrustful eye. However, it is vital in trade negotiations writ broad that we keep positive momentum going. The Chairman has alluded to the dangers of uncertainty. I share his concern about uncertainty, but uncertainty is much more tolerable if we are moving in a positive direction. Right now, unfortunately, the U.S. stand on tariffs, coupled with the EU stand on agriculture, makes positive momentum extremely difficult to achieve. In agriculture, I am in favor of trusting to sound science. U.S. food is bountiful, it is for sale, and it is safe. We should lose no opportunity to emphasize the scientific clarity of the findings that U.S. agriculture is a boon to the United States and a boon to the world, and we should try our best to encourage Europe to take agricultural trade on the basis of sound science, not on the basis of panic, fear-mongering, and anti-Americanism of the sort which did so much damage to the TTIP negotiations.
I couldn't agree more with you, Doctor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Trone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. and thank you to the witnesses for coming out today. Dr. Hamilton, the European Commission will soon experience a change in leadership, though it's not yet clear which candidate will win the presidency. Given those dynamics between the U.S. and the EU, how realistic of a time frame do you see for trade negotiations to be concluded during President Trump's current term in office?
I think they're very low for a number of reasons. As you mentioned, one reason is this commission is ending. It ends in the fall, so whoever we're negotiating with won't be the current person, and they're all packing their bags. I mean, what I call the European Commission strategy right now is rope-a-dope. If you're in the boxing ring and you're getting beat up and you're waiting for the bell to ring to prolong the match, you just throw your opponent up and keep prolonging for time. And I think basically that's what the Commission is doing. So I don't think this Commission is not going to be the partner to finish the deal, and we don't know what comes after that. But if I could just say, I think what Dr. Broman said and what was just said, we also have just a fundamental disagreement on what this negotiation is supposed to be about. The Europeans don't want agriculture. I would share his view. It's a non-starter with the Congress, certainly, to have anything unless agriculture is included. The U.S., though, doesn't want to include government procurement, and that's the EU's major ask. And so we're not moving forward on that, and where the tariff looming threat makes this more difficult.
So quickly, President Obama, very popular with many of our European partners, despite ups and downs in the transatlantic relationship, and yet the TTIP, of course, failed. President Trump, much less popular in Europe. Would any potential U.S. trade deal play out given these dynamics at all? And does his popularity matter?
I think it does. I think the idea of, if I may be frank, of concluding a trade deal with President Trump is not going to gain a lot of European support, not just in terms of public opinion, but very specific things. The French, for instance, and the EU, but the French in particular, did not sign up to the mandate the EU gave to the Commission to negotiate right now. They are adamant that they're not going to agree to any commitment that doesn't include signatory to the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So they are now blocking what they can within the EU. That's just one example of that. And so I think the time to negotiate these things just takes so long. This Commission is going to transition toward the end of the year. We'll be in our election season. I just don't see a prospect that this is going to happen during the remainder of this congressional term or presidential term.
Dr. Bowen, I'm concerned about linkages President Trump has made between trade tariffs and sometimes unrelated political issues, like his surprise announcement earlier this month to put tariffs on Mexico for their failure to stop migration into the U.S. While he since pulled back on that threat, I think this approach is counterproductive, confusing, especially with our allies. My question is, how does this impact U.S. government's ability to negotiate trade deals going forward? And are our trade partners wary of agreeing to any concessions, knowing the President might add new, unrelated demands at the 11th hour?
I think that's exactly the problem. By essentially reneging on the agreement, which was close to what happened with Mexico, tying it to something that was completely untrade related, a serious issue, but not related to trade. That, in a very real sense, undermined the value of Mexico conducting the USMCA negotiations in good faith with the Trump administration. And partners around the world watched that, and saw that, and said, we may be wary to negotiate a trade deal with this administration in the first place, but this gives us even less comfort because anything that we might negotiate with them could then be taken away.
One last question quickly there. The German Federation of Industries has started referring to China as a systemic competitor. Does that change their alliance, their stance toward China? And does that open up an opportunity for us to work more closely with the Europeans to make progress vis-a-vis China? Dr. Bowen.
I think there are real opportunities for additional cooperation with Europe. I think, to its credit, the Trump administration, by highlighting these concerns with China, has raised them globally. And I think the Europeans are in a very different place than they were, 2 or 3 or 4 years ago on a lot of these issues. And there are now opportunities that we really shouldn't be wasting.
Thank you.
Chair now recognizes a gentleman who's been waiting a long time for this hearing because he can speak firsthand of so many of its effects, potentially. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today. And indeed, I appreciate the reference to BMW. Incredible. I was there for the groundbreaking for BMW, and the subsequent nature of this. Last year, they achieved $10.4 billion in exports from the United States around the world. You had referenced how significant it was, but it's multi-billion-dollar of export. And then our state has so benefited from foreign investments. In my home community, we have Michelin Corporation has their largest tire manufacturing facilities in the world, to be exported out of the Port of Charleston also. And this goes along with Continental Tire of Germany. And so, and now South Carolina is the leading manufacturer and exporter of tires of any state union, beginning just 30 years ago with zero. So we see the benefit, and I want to thank each of you for your for the input that you've had here today. And Ms. Corlins, what would be the potential impact of auto tariffs on the U.S. auto industry? Would we feel as much pain as the Europeans do?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. I think it's important to state at the outset that indeed there is no domestic constituency for these proposed auto tariffs. I think my colleagues on the panel have identified the potential costs in terms of the increased price of cars and auto parts. They've talked about the potential for job loss and unfair competition. It's important to understand that as compared to steel and aluminum, imposing tariffs on autos and auto parts would amount to a tenfold increase in the impact of potential trade barriers. So I think it goes without saying that the impacts would be felt far and wide. I want to underscore, though, just one point, and that is that while we are spending a lot of time talking about these potential tariffs, it's important to recognize that Europe is not above reproach in its trade practices. And I just want to make sure that members of the subcommittee do understand that there are several issues, legitimate issues, that we have to address in doing business with Europe. And that's why we think these negotiations are so critically important.
And Dr. Broman, where do things currently stand on Brexit? Is there a role for U.S. to play to encourage a successful conclusion to the Brexit dilemma?
Thank you, Congressman. The U.S. should exert all of its energies to encourage both the United Kingdom and the European Union to come to a speedy resolution of this dilemma. It seems clear from the UK's successive votes on Prime Minister May's withdrawal agreement that there is no domestic basis in the UK for passing this withdrawal agreement through the House of Commons. It is therefore likely that the UK will either exit the EU without a deal or that the basis for a new deal will have to be negotiated. If the former, the no-deal scenario, is true, the UK opens itself up as a negotiating partner for FTA with the United States, an opportunity we should seize. However, if there is an opportunity for a satisfactory negotiated exit for the UK from the European Union, this is something the United States could, and I believe should, use its good offices to seek both sides to persuade and to accept.
And Dr. Broman, at the beginning of the year, the UK, France, and Germany announced a new channel for non-dollar trade between the EU and Tehran in order to bypass U.S. sanctions on Iran called INSEX. What is the What are the ramifications of setting up such a mechanism, and what has been the consequence?
The immediate ramifications in financial terms have been relatively small. However, the broader implications of this measure are significant. One of the U.S.'s most important tools in international relations, broadly defined, I'm not talking here simply about trade, is the power of the U.S. dollar and the centrality of the U.S. as a financial market and a global investment market. Measures like this European measure threaten to circumvent the U.S. ability to achieve foreign policy objectives by using the power of the dollar and the centrality of the U.S. in investment markets. And this can only have a negative effect on the U.S.'s ability to achieve its foreign policy objectives in areas far divorced from trade.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Chairman Keating.
Thank the gentleman. The Chair now recognizes the Vice Chair of the committee, Ms. Spanberger from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Following up on the line of questioning and discussion that we've heard so far, just for level setting, on February 17th, 2019, the Secretary of Commerce transmitted to the White House a report on his investigation into the effects of imports of automobiles and certain automobile parts on the national security of the United States under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. And on June 14th, President Trump sent a letter to Congress stating that he concurred with the Secretary's finding that automobiles and certain automobile parts are being imported into the United States in such quantities and under such circumstances as to threaten and impair the national security of the United States. So I share some of the concerns that have been expressed here today. Notably, 232 emerged out of the Cold War, under the Cold War, has typically been used against oil and petroleum. And when we look at auto-related trade accounts, auto-related trade accounts for only 8% of bilateral trade between the United States and the EU. And we see such an impact on U.S. jobs. I'm struggling and challenged with this notion of how this national security determination has been made. And so my question for you as experts, former U.S. officials as well, and in your current role, Ms. Chorlins, for example, with the U.S. Chamber, is it clear to you what criteria was used to assign a national security threat to the automobile imports?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. Because the report has not been made public, it's impossible for us to know the exact criteria that were used. I think what we can say is that the administration has made it clear that, especially with the case of the steel and aluminum tariffs, and presumably with the auto tariffs as well, or the threat of auto tariffs, that this is indeed designed to create negotiating leverage, to bring our trading partners to the table, and to force concessions from them. So in terms of the actual criteria, I'm afraid I don't have specifics for you.
And how does that create a challenge in your current role, for example, in trying to advocate on behalf of U.S. businesses being privy to those sorts of relationships between the United States and the EU, having this lack of understanding related to the 232 tariffs that the United States has imposed?
Well, I think as the other panelists have suggested, the tremendous uncertainty is of grave concern, certainly to the American business community. Mainly what we would like to see is for the U.S. and Europe to actually make progress on the areas that they have agreed to discuss. So they've talked about reducing non-auto industrial tariffs. We think that kind of conversation should go forward. They've talked about improvements regarding conformity assessments and mutual recognition agreements. It's our understanding that those conversations are happening at a technical level. Those sorts of somewhat arcane measures are nonetheless of great significance to American businesses. So we'd like to see these existing talks go forward. We would love for them to be more comprehensive, to include not just industrial goods, but also, as I said earlier, services, investment, and procurement. But we recognize that we have limited opportunities here, and we feel like we should leverage this momentum.
Thank you. And Dr. Hamilton, would like to pose a question to you, given your previous background with the Department of State. In an issue that's been important for many of us here is ensuring that we are asserting our Article I authorities. Do you have an opinion, sir, on what role Congress should play in overseeing Section 232 tariffs, particularly given the foreign policy implications of such decisions and frequently in this case, the national security reasoning for the implementation of such tariffs?
Thank you for the question. I agree with Dr. Bowen's comments on that, which is basically the authority rests with the Congress regarding commerce. And so the Congress should uphold its own authority on that issue. This is an area in which it's commercial relations that have national security foreign policy impact. So this committee is where those two things come together. So it seems to me it is a constitutional prerogative of the Congress to assert its role here and to conduct not only oversight, but to exert its congressional rights. So I think, as Dr. Bowen said, I think this should be examined very closely, and there should be a congressional role here whenever the executive is trying to assert these rights. I think on your other question, the uncertainty impact, extends to other areas. You mentioned the national security implication of this had been done before with oil and gas. Well, now we're in a new position with oil and gas. We're trying to sell it to the Europeans. But you can imagine if there's uncertainty about us as a reliable supplier, what that will do then to our ability now to create this new channel of transatlantic commerce. It's the argument we're making, frankly, about the Russians. To the Europeans, we're saying they're not reliable.
Yeah.
Well, you can imagine the Europeans might be asking themselves, well, are you reliable either?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Chair, thanks the gentlelady for your questions, and particularly bringing up Congress's role, because we have another role, too, in Congress, and that's representing a jurisdictional district, territories and regions of the United States. And if you look at the materials that have been forwarded to the committee, breaking that down by state, you'll see the importance of that from a state-by-state basis. So thank you for the question and your responses. And Chair recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi, Representative Guest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Broman, I want to start by following up a little bit on what Congressman Pence was speaking about as it relates to agriculture. Mississippi is a large producer of agricultural products. American poultry has been banned in the EU. The American Farm Bureau statistics tell us that we have an $11 billion deficit with the EU as it relates to agricultural products. The average U.S. tariff for imported agricultural products is roughly 5%. For the EU, the average tariff on imported agricultural products is roughly 3 times higher than that at 14%. We know that trade negotiators on behalf of the EU have said that agriculture will not be part of these negotiations, that this is what they described as a red line. You say in your written testimony on page 4 and 5, you talk a little bit about some of those. You say that eliminating tariffs for non-automobile industrial goods would be a major gain for the U.S. economy and the EU, but so would an end to the EU's agricultural protectionism. And you list both France and Belgium as 2 of the major driving factors behind their reluctance to include that in current negotiations. And so I guess my question to you, Dr. Broman, what can we do to make sure that we are applying the necessary pressure on our friends in the EU that they are seriously considering opening up their agriculture industry to American products?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I would point out that EU, and this began even before the European Union came into existence as the EU agricultural protectionism has 2 fundamental sources. First, there is the long-run impact of the Common Agricultural Policy, which rests on the political importance of agricultural constituencies in the European Union. Although, of course, the relative size of the EU agricultural sector has declined over the years, as it has in the United States, this still represents an important political constituency in the EU, and we need to recognize that fact without for a moment excusing the protectionism that flows from it. Second, and this is unfortunately more recent, there is a broad-based and very popular political campaign in the European Union against U.S. agricultural exports. This was, in my judgment, the single most important factor behind the European rejection of TTIP, the belief that opening up the EU markets through TTIP to U.S. agriculture would be bad for bad for EU consumers, as well as, less importantly, bad for EU agricultural producers. What I'm afraid these two things have in common is they can only be resolved by European political leadership. We need to make it very clear that just as I condemn U.S. industrial protectionism through steel, aluminum, and potentially car tariffs, we expect EU political leaders to show the same level of support in condemning their own protectionism. We cannot negotiate, politically speaking, an industrial free trade goods agreement without also negotiating politically in the United States an agriculture free trade agreement. For us, those two things are politically inseparable, and I would add they are both economically beneficial for us and EU consumers. So I think we have to call on European political leaders to exercise significant political leadership, as the Congress is trying to do in this U.S. case, to push European agricultural producers and to push EU agricultural consumers to recognize that importing U.S. agricultural goods is a good thing, a healthy thing, and an important thing for the wider health of the U.S.-EU trade relationship.
And do you believe that the EU leaders understand the importance of opening up agriculture as at least a negotiating point for any future agreements?
I have no doubt they understand its importance. That's why the French refused to do it.
And one final question, Dr. Broman, just kind of changing gears. You stay on page 9 of your written statement. You say that today it is becoming a commonplace that the world will be divided into spheres of trading influence, either a Chinese sphere and a Western one, or a U.S. sphere, a European one, and a Chinese one. Can you expand on that just very briefly?
This is now a commonplace observation, the idea that the future of the world rests with great powers or great trading spheres, potentially a U.S. one, a European one, and a Chinese one, or else a U.S. and European one combined versus a Chinese sphere. This is an outcome that we should do everything in our power to avert. U.S. strategy in the Cold War did not rest around trying to create a bipolar world between the U.S. and the USSR. In the Cold War, we fought for freedom for our allies as much as freedom for ourselves. It is profoundly not in American interest for the world to be divided up into 2 or 3 economic trading spheres of influence. We want the broadest freedom for ourselves, and we want broad freedom for our allies, even to the extent that they may on occasion disagree with us, as they have in the past, as they are now, and as they will undoubtedly do in the future. But the idea of a world divided up, George Orwell style, into 3 competing trading continents is a profoundly unappealing and I would say un-American one. We should do everything in our power to preserve certainly our own trading freedom and our own prosperity, but also the trading freedom and prosperity of our allies as well.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes a leader in transatlantic relationships, gentleman from California, Mr. Costa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is an important hearing for the subcommittee. Taking your thesis, which I tend to agree with, Dr. Broman, it seems to me that yet when you look at the United States and Canadian economies with Europe, we still constitute over half the world's economy. And when you talk about rules-based systems, integrity of respect for law, a judiciary system for appeals of these cases, we have far more in common with our transatlantic relationship, Canada and us, than these other parts of the world. And frankly, we have the ability still to write the rules for the 21st century in terms of a world-based economy. And I think we should not lose sight of that opportunity, notwithstanding our current differences. I think the politics that we're both aware of in Europe and here have to be played out. Do you think that ultimately the procurement issue in Europe and the agricultural issues here ultimately constitute the basis for some sort of a compromise as we at some point move to the position of renegotiation, some version of a TTIP? Both Mr. Broman and Dr. Hamilton and anyone else who would like to opine.
It's an intriguing idea. Unfortunately, the question is, what are the relevant constituencies in the EU and the United States? In the United States, the opposition to opening up government procurement rests on the idea that U.S. taxpayer funds should be directed to benefit U.S. consumers and U.S. corporations. In the EU, the opposition to opening up agricultural markets to U.S. competition rests partly on EU agricultural producers, but also on a sector of EU.
No, I realize that, but let's give examples of what reality is. When you look at the automobile market, we're playing on both sides, both Europeans and the U.S. When you look at the issues of our new strike joint fighter, you know, the Europeans are buying it, we're manufacturing it, and you've got parts being made in Europe. I mean, the reality is that when Europeans come to America, they can go to any of our major grocery stores and find all the wonderful cheeses that are produced in Europe, as well as the European wines. That's the reality. So, I mean, how we get past that in terms, I get the politics in France and in Italy and in all the other countries when it comes to Parma or Gorgonzola or all those kinds of nice naming items. So therefore, my question is the Commission and the commissioners negotiate the trade agreements. The Parliament ultimately has to pass. We're not as familiar with their system as we should be, I think. Under the next new European Commission, I think we ought to try to figure out a way to break through this in terms of the politics and to get our own committees that have the jurisdiction in these areas meeting with the European parliamentary committees and having hearings here and having hearings there in Europe to meet with these constituencies. Do you think there would be some mileage in that, Dr. Hamilton?
Absolutely. Congressman, you know from your great work that there is a great appetite for that on the European side. You know, the EU caucus here could play a role. The Transatlantic Leadership Network plays a role. There are a number of things that could be done. One idea would be simply when you are considering legislation on each side of the Atlantic that might affect the other, whether you sort of have an early warning type of mechanism so you can understand what the potential legislation coming down the road might be and understand how that might affect each other. That could be just a video conference with your colleagues. You wouldn't have to necessarily fly everywhere. And, you know, I think modern technology allows sort of these parliamentary types of exchanges now on fundamental, substantive legislative ideas that could help things.
Well, once our commission gets formed, I think we've got to figure out a way to get out of the box here because, let me ask you another question. They've completed an agreement with Canada and now with Mexico, and they're negotiating with the Mercosur countries. Do you think those successful conclusions of those treaties offer a template for us once we're ready to sit down and have a real negotiation again?
I don't, because I think we would be the pioneers. We would be negotiating something that is far beyond what any of these other agreements have been, which are always lower standard than what we have. I think you're right that the critical thing to me seems to be these two issues. We need something on agriculture. They really want the public procurement. Each has a problem. The federal government often isn't the real answer on public procurement because many U.S. states actually don't subscribe to a lot of international standards on opening up public procurement markets. So somehow our states would have to go along with this. That's very hard. On the European side, instead of just thinking market access, which is, I agree, a problem, one can think about the types of things you mentioned, that there are a lot of regulatory issues where we could agree to certain standards on health and safety that I could see us moving forward on in the agriculture area that's beyond just the trade piece of things. So I do think there's, if the will is there, there's a possibility. The problem we have is we have a limited mandate on both sides now, or we're arguing about it. And, you know, to be WTO compliant with the trade agreement, it has to cover what they call substantially all trade. Well, the current negotiation won't do that. So that was the original idea behind the TTIP, which let's put it all together so that there is enough room for some trade-offs on both sides. We were 97% of the way there. So I think
we had made a lot of progress.
We have, and I think one could come back to some of that in the future.
Well, I think we're going to have to. And your definition of bilateral, because I know the President attempted to do, as Chancellor Merkel tried to explain, that the European Union is one entity and we're one entity, so that is bilateral. But
that's right.
That's my definition of bilateral. Do all of you agree that's a definition of bilateral? Seems to me.
Right.
My time's expired, and we need to continue this conversation, Mr. Chairman, and look forward to working with you as we figure out ways with the Constitution. And this is part of the problem. After the elections, they're reorganizing now, and only 250 of the returning members of the European Parliament out of 761, which means over 500 of them are brand new. And so we're going to have some time and patience as we work through this aspect and with the new commission as well.
Chair would like to thank the witnesses for adjusting their schedule because of the roll calls and the delay that ensued from that. And thank you for your very well-informed testimony. This is something that we will have to pursue as not just a subcommittee, but as the full committee and as a Congress. The opportunities here are enormous. The challenges are great. It's unfortunate. I would have liked to have seen, frankly, what would have happened if TTIP had been in the front end instead of TPP, when there was a lot more commonality of thought, and I think we could have really had the thing moving, and it picked up a lot of momentum. We're not there because of circumstances we couldn't control, but the greater good to the U.S., the greater good to our allies in Europe is so enormous, not just an economic benefit, but also in our shared values, in the environment, the shared concern we have for that, intellectual property being guarded, having a rule of law, and a belief in fair wages and safe working conditions. All these values that we share together are great. But I would say this, that in the absence of us moving forward in this area of mutual benefit, there will be indeed a vacuum. And that vacuum will be filled with countries and entities that don't share those same values. And it will not have the beneficial effect. So to me, I know the challenges, but the penalties that are there and what's going to happen if we don't move forward ourselves and what we'll be facing is a far greater concern. So I hope we can continue this discussion. I hope we can move forward as a Congress and a Parliament and engage the business community to be a part of this. It's necessary, and move forward. There'll be a little rebranding. TTIP probably will be a thing of the past. But I believe if we work together, we will have success. So thank you for your words here today, your testimony, and if there are any other questions, we'll follow up. This hearing is adjourned.